During the judicial review, one of the people that had approached me was a guy called Derek who ran a business in the Vale of Evesham. They had been undercut for years by Channel Island horticulturalists. Derek was, like all the other people, was over the moon when the whole thing was shut down. He rang me up one day and said that he had been at a meeting in London and had met a lawyer called Les Allen who knew about my case and was interested in it. Les was a very swanky high-end law firm used by wealthy people. I rang Les on his phone number that Derek had given me. Les immediately said, this is outrageous. Have you considered taking legal action? We got talking. And the next thing, we were preparing basically to sue HMRC.
This is The Corruption Diaries, a series from the Tax Justice Network. I'm Naomi Fowler. This season is about Richard Allen. He ran a music business that was destroyed by a tax loophole and successfully campaigned to close it. In December 2012, Richard and his new lawyer, Les Allen, lodged their complaint.
I had the kind of rock and roll law firm representing me. I'm eternally grateful to Les Allen. He acted for me throughout the whole thing, pro bono. If he hadn't taken that on, I wouldn't be talking to you now. I wouldn't have got all of the documents that I then subsequently pieced together everything that I'm able to tell you now. I never would have understood what had happened to me and who did what and when. I would be completely in the dark.
In previous episodes, you heard about the court case and how years after his fight began, the Channel Islands loophole was finally scrapped. In January 2013, a flurry of news reports came out about offshore fulfilment staff in Jersey losing their jobs, and Richard was watching it all unfold.
The whole thing shut down immediately. Play.com announced they were closing. There was a lot of news items in the Channel Islands, and all of the big warehouses that we use for mail order now lie derelict. I felt sorry for the people that worked there. I was involved in a talk show on Channel Islands radio. One of the deputies there had worked in the fulfilment industry.
Deputies are their elected representatives.
They were trying to argue that people were in the Channel Islands because of the good weather and, Well, I mean, how could running a mail order business on an island on the other side of the channel be of any advantage in any way, shape or form unless there was a tax advantage? People even tried to blame me. I was getting emails saying, this is harming people in the Channel Islands. I said, look, the people that were harmed because they were led to believe they had a secure job when the job was actually based on a tax scam. The people you want to blame are the people that run your islands. You need to speak to them.
For Richard, the consequences had also been enormous. He'd lost his business because he'd refused to join other companies taking advantage of the tax loophole. He'd spent years fighting it.
I only ever fought from a defensive position. Firstly to save my business, and then when that failed, to recover the value of what was taken away from me. Obviously, suing the tax authority is not to be taken lightly. I thought I could not live with myself if I never did, because I'd have this what if hanging over me for the rest of my life. One of the things that was motivating me by that point was I could not have started up a business selling music mail order because it was completely unviable until that problem was fixed. And I was also motivated by a great deal of anger. What had I got to lose? I had lost all my business anyway. I thought, what the hell, let's sue them. I remember people saying to me, you're suing HMRC, are you nuts? I said, promoting a prog band is probably harder than suing HMRC. Yeah.
Richard's case against HMRC was for their slowness to act against the Channel Islands and shut down the LVCR Channel Islands loophole, and their failure to act to prevent its abuse.
My claim was based on a famous EU legal case called Francovich. In that case, Italy failed to put EU employment rights into law, and a man named Andrea Francovich successfully sued the Italian government.
Francovich and some of his colleagues worked for a company in Italy that went into liquidation and their salaries weren't paid. Francovich went to court asking to be compensated, and the court ruled in his favour and against the Italian government.
From that case, a principle developed. If a country doesn't properly apply EU law, anyone who can show their rights were breached as a result can claim compensation from the state if they can demonstrate they were harmed. My argument was that the UK didn't correctly apply the VAT rules around low-value consignment relief, and those rules were meant to ensure a fair market without abuse or distortion. Because the UK permitted abuse, the right to trade in a fair market was undermined, so much so that it became impossible to compete effectively and I suffered harm. We lodged proceedings against HMRC. We felt that was a really important argument that should go all the way to the European Court and be argued there. After I lodged the claim against HMRC, the first thing I did was I made a Freedom of Information request to the European Commission for all the correspondence between the UK and the EU. That's a big ask. I was asking to see all of the letters between officials and the Commission. The Commission said we've had this from the UK and they sent through this argument. It was a big long document.
When you make a Freedom of Information request to the EU Commission, a member state has the right to object. When Richard made his Freedom of Information request to the Commission, they had to inform the UK. The UK then employed a barrister to fight the release of this correspondence.
They fought that tooth and nail. So it's 2 years fighting for that, and that was between 2012 and 2014.
But eventually Richard won out.
I got all the documents. Some of it was redacted, but there was enough there to read. And when I got it, I was absolutely amazed because in that correspondence, you could see that officials had been giving incorrect information to the Commission. And you could see the point at which the UK had given up and decided to change the legislation in the UK.
Richard and Les, his lawyer, submitted his claim against HMRC.
I got this letter from HMRC and it said something along the lines of, we totally reject your arguments, paraphrasing it here. You want to be careful because this will cost you a lot of money.
The letter sent to Richard's lawyer from HMRC in February 2014 reads, quote, I must at this stage mention that if this case proceeded to a hearing and your client's claim was rightly dismissed, then an order for costs would be sought without hesitation against your client. You'll also be aware that High Court litigation is rarely inexpensive, and your client's claim would be no exception.
I regarded it as threatening, basically. It was like a red rag to a bull. I thought, I'm not going to take that from anybody. I don't know what went through the minds of those in HMRC's legal team, but it seemed to me that they thought I was a problem. But I was brought up not to submit to threats from bullies, basically. And having got that far, I wasn't about to capitulate, which is what I would have had to do had I accepted that letter. After Les took on my case...
That's Les Allen, the lawyer from the fancy law firm.
I started looking around and I came across this thing called litigation funding, which is investors that basically invest in litigation that has a very high chance of being successful. It was in its early days at that point, but I eventually found somebody who showed an interest in it. What they do is they take your case and they run it past professionals and lawyers to see whether they agree that this has a high chance of success. This funder took me on. So all those people that say my case was doomed to failure, well, they wouldn't have taken my case on if it didn't have a strong chance of success. However, its chance of success was completely tied to getting to the European Court. I remember at the time thinking, well, the only thing that's going to scupper this is if we leave the EU. That's never going to happen. And then, of course, 2016, along came the referendum. I remember the day that we left the EU. Julie woke me up.
Julie is Richard's wife.
And said that we've left the EU. I just couldn't believe it. And then I got a phone call literally within an hour from the litigation funder going, where does this leave us? And I said, absolutely no idea. Nobody knew what was going on with that for years, literally, because no one even understood what leaving meant. All it meant was it introduced so much uncertainty, the litigation funder withdrew their funding. And I also had the other problem of, because it was Francovich, in the actual EU withdrawal bill, it said Francovich will be no longer regarded as a precedent in UK law. So literally, the case upon which I was relying was going to be removed. I then had to speak to my MP, Cheryl Gillan, who was fantastic. And I then worked with Cheryl, and she made interventions in the Brexit withdrawal bill debate. And she put in an amendment to the Brexit withdrawal bill that would have protected my position.
And here she is speaking in the UK Law Repeal Bill debate in November 2017 in the House of Commons.
Mrs. Cheryl Gillan. Thank you very much. I rise to my feet to move Amendments 303 and 304. These particular amendments relate to a specific constituency case of mine, the right of an individual to sue a member state for damages where the law has been incorrectly applied and has caused them harm is a right that is ultimately reliant upon the rulings of the European Court and a legal precedent that I think many of the lawyers that I'm surrounded by here know as Francovich. This reference to the European Court will occur, for example, when the interpretation of rules pertaining to the application of VAT across the EU is required.
There was also a very big debate in the House of Lords. It became all very esoteric, but in the end, I was able to continue with the claim because it had been lodged prior to Brexit. That was the key point.
But Brexit also threw another spanner in the works. Before the referendum, HMRC had agreed that the matter should be resolved in the EU court. But after Brexit happened, HMRC then opposed the case going to the EU court. That meant a case that was really a European one would have to be heard in the UK. By 2018, it had been 6 years since he'd initially lodged his claim, and the stress of it was getting to him.
There was a whole load of procedural nonsense that kept jumping up. Every now and then there'll be some kind of hearing that has to be had and you have to panic and produce a load of paperwork. But it was the waiting, it just went on and on and on. When you're in that period waiting for it to be heard, you're in limbo. You're constantly thinking about it. That has an impact upon you. It's just constant stress. It gets to you. I later discovered there was a thing called litigation stress disorder. There was a moment where, I just felt just completely in the dark. And I used to lay at night with, the voices in your head saying, you made the wrong decision, you're going to lose, another voice saying you're going to win, and that just goes on and on and on, drives you mad. That start affecting people around me, my behaviour. You become obsessive. In my darkest hour, the guilt was quite a heavy weight. I felt responsible for burdening my family with a fight that should have been only mine. When you're caught in the maelstrom, all you can do is fix your gaze on the faintest glimmer of light and hope that it's real.
Richard's case was finally heard on the 12th of March 2019. He travelled to London and made his way to the Rolls building on Fetter Lane in central London. On the indicator board it said, Allen versus Her Majesty's Treasury and another, and it was listed for 10:30am in Court 12.
When we got to court with this, we agreed that we would just look at the principle of, is there a right arising from the VAT directive for individuals who are affected by abuse, avoidance and evasion.
The hearing lasted less than 2 days. Richard then waited about a month for the judgment.
I got judgment against me. Actually, half was in my favour, half wasn't. HMRC had argued that we should have gone to judicial review and we were out of time. The judge dismissed that. And the second point was, is there a right arising from the VAT directive that Mr. Allen can claim against? He said, I can't see one. Well, and that was it. I thought, we'll appeal this, it's rubbish.
Richard believes the ruling in his case was lacking the kind of reasoning the European Court would have applied. Francovich claims are complex because the rights of individuals to damages aren't explicitly stated in EU law. They're an implied legal consequence of the member state failing to implement EU law correctly.
And then we put in an appeal and that was rejected. And again, the appeal rejection was like, I agree with the judge.
At this point, legally, Richard's options were limited. He couldn't afford to spend any more time or risk money on litigation, and he'd run out of energy. It was time to give up.
Was it worth it? Would I do it again? Yes. If you're going to fight back against something that's unjust, you need to be prepared to accept the fact that there will be downsides to that. You'll go through some dark places when you're doing it, but you will come out the other end of it wiser and stronger. I thought we were all taught to uphold rights and fight for what was right. I obtained all of the information I wanted to obtain, even though I didn't obtain a judgment in my favour. I now know exactly what went on. Without a doubt, it affected our family, but in many ways it made it stronger in the longer term. My daughter's now a lawyer. I'm pretty confident she wouldn't have ended up being a lawyer if I hadn't been involved in so much litigation. We've grown closer together as a family, I think, as a result. I actually think if it had got to European Court, we had a good chance of winning that argument, but it probably would have cost me another 10 years of my life and huge amounts of money.
But it wasn't over yet, and what happened next threatened to obliterate him.
I thought, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this. I mean, I was like facing huge costs. Normally, in a public interest case, each side would bear their own costs. Now, I think if there was ever a public interest case, mine was one. However, we should have made that application for public interest before we commenced the hearing.
Richard now had to wait to see what costs, his own and those of HMRC, he might have to pay.
The tax authority, HMRC, were silent. I thought maybe they're not going to hit me with any costs. And then suddenly we got a bill, and then they increased it. So I think the first one was about 80 something, and it went up to 125.
That's £125,000, or roughly 166,000 US dollars.
And that was over Christmas 2019. There was a deadline, I can't remember what it was, early that year where I had to accept these costs. They had employed the same barrister who was defending them in the court case to deal with that Freedom of Information request.
That was Richard's Freedom of Information request for a document that he'd made at the beginning of his case, suing for compensation. Anyone can make a request for publicly held documents under the Freedom of Information Act.
And they had added all the costs for fighting that Freedom of Information request into my costs on the court case, which I thought was despicable. It's my right to make a Freedom of Information request, and if you want to employ a barrister to attempt to stop me getting it, that's up to you. Those huge costs, I sat on them for about 6 months, and my tactic initially was I'll just try and, fend them off in some way. So I sort of prevaricated, and it got to the point where they were insisting that I basically agree to the costs that they'd sent me, or it would go to court for a costs hearing. And I remember I was quite despondent, and I had a phone call from the correspondent at the Times.
That's the Times newspaper.
He said, I've been told everything about what's happening. I will cover this. I said, look, would you just, point out the fact how unjust this is, the fact that I've saved this country huge amounts of money, protected loads of businesses, and I'm being treated like this by HMRC. And on the Monday, I just sent the email off to HMRC and said, I accept your costs. And by the way, here's a copy of a piece from the Times.
The Times article headline was, Taxman turns on campaigner who saved us £200 million a year.
And at that point, I'd actually filled out the bankruptcy form on the website, and all I had to do was press the button and I would have gone bankrupt. Within hours, I had an email back from HMRC saying, we'll accept 10,000. It had dropped from 125,000 down to 10,000. I was sort of jumping around the garden in relief. I just sent out an email to everybody that had supported me and explained the situation and said that it had dropped to £10,000 and immediately offered me money to cover it. I was saved by the unexpected kindness of strangers. I just felt loved, I suppose, for what I'd done, which was, a real surprise in many ways. During that whole period, I was a bit sort of stunned. It's only really later that I looked back on it and thought, wow, I can't believe that I actually escaped from that. I would never choose to relive that experience, but I don't regret it, not for a moment.
You've been listening to episode 12 of The Corruption Diaries, season 2 from the Tax Justice Network, with me, Naomi Fowler, produced by me and by Leo Schick. Sound design also by Leo Schick. In the next episode, Richard and a few fellow campaigners uncover another enormous VAT or VAT fraud.
And initially I just didn't believe it. It was like enormous. It was like £1 billion a year in VAT evasion. And I looked at this and I said, this is unbelievable. I mean, this makes the Channel Islands look like a tea party. Delirium Records music used in this episode was courtesy of Cherry Red. If you liked a song, see the track listing in the episode notes.